Hello and welcome back to The Scriptures Are Real. I'm your co-host today, Lamar, and this is my other co-host, Kerry Mulestein. You see Kerry a lot more than you see me, but that's okay. I'm happy to be here and hope we can set some good things up and have a good discussion about Daniel.
I'm happy to be here doing it with you.
You're in a different spot today, Kerry, but that's all right.
Yeah. My normal little recording spot is occupied by someone else right now. So
all right.
I'm in the front room.
Got to book the studio time. All right. Well, great. Yeah. Today we're going to be in Daniel 1-6 for the Come Follow Me reading. And Kerry, there's a lot to cover in here, and I don't know how much we're going to get through today, but let's give it a shot. Let's set it up first. Now, I know if people have been following your other podcasts through Jeremiah and so forth, you've talked about the different attacking armies. Now, when I was with you last time, we were talking about the Assyrians who were coming in, and Isaiah was talking about the Assyrians. But now the Assyrians were finally beaten off, and they went back home, and then the Babylonians come. But let's set it up. Give us a recap of what you talked about in Jeremiah and how that ties into these chapters.
Well, it sounds great. And yeah, we want to give kind of a little bit of a different emphasis to this one. But the background for the beginning of Jeremiah and Daniel and Ezekiel are all about the same, because it's the same events, the same place, right? So I did quite a bit in Ezekiel as well. But I think you have a good point. It's easy because we did the history books so long ago, and now we're doing the prophetic books, and we do Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Daniel, to kind of mix it all together with Isaiah, especially where we spent 5 weeks on Isaiah. Mm-hmm. But Isaiah, like the miraculous rescue of Jerusalem, is about 700 BC, 701 BC. And most of what we're talking about now and with Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and Daniel is about 600 BC. So we're 100 years later, and the Assyrian Empire has fallen. Right. And sometimes 100 years seems like a small amount of time when we're thinking Old Testament stuff, because we're dealing with such huge things. But also think about how many things can happen in 100 years. Like, think of everything that's happened since 1922. Right. We've had, the world's changed.
Oh, yeah.
Right? And the big, Germany was a big, powerful threat in the, early 1900s and mid 1900s. Where no one's worried about Germany taking over the world right now, right? So that's just an example of how these things can change. So the Assyrian army, or the Assyrians, were conquered by Babylon, and it's important to note for the book of Daniel some history that we didn't cover with Ezekiel or Jeremiah, because Daniel was younger than they were. So while his story starts at around that same time, he lives longer than they do. So part of the book of Daniel takes place after the Persians conquer the Babylonians. So you have him serving in the Babylonian Empire, then you have him serving in the Persian Empire. Right. So we want to know both of those histories. So when the Babylonians come and Judah becomes a vassal state as they switch allegiance under Jehoiakim from the Egyptians to the Babylonians, but he switches allegiance, and then pretty soon he rebels. And so the Babylonians have to come in under King Nebuchadnezzar, and they sack Jerusalem. This is not the time they destroy the temple, but they do take some treasures from the temple and put it in their temple as a sign that their God is more powerful and that they've controlled the country and so on. And when they do that, they take a bunch of people with them, and there are two kinds or groups of people that they take. They're taking, in general, it's the elite and the powerful and so on. And so they take the biggest majority of those, and they just have them settle in a town by the Chabar River. And that's the group that Ezekiel is with. But they take some young, very elites to the court. And this is a practice, actually, the Egyptians had started this practice like 1,000 years before that. And the idea is that you take some of the royalty and others who will would have been huge influences in the kingdom you've conquered, and you raise them in your court, in your culture, so that they feel grateful for you. That the king becomes their guy who's taking care of them. So there's a father figure. So you're thoroughly familiar with that culture and so on. And there are two reasons for this. One, you end up with people, if you're the king of Babylon, you end up with people in your court who can advise you. They know their culture they came from well enough that they can advise you and help you understand that.
Right,
and
on the customs, traditions, and so forth.
Exactly right. And if you have problems with the rulers who are there and needed to depose them and send someone back to be king, then you have some royalties and people who they might accept as being kings or rulers or elite, but that know the Babylonian culture and hopefully are ingratiated to the Babylonians, and so they'll be good representatives for you. So that's exactly what happens. Is he takes a handful of young elites and raises them in his court, and that's Daniel and his friends. So they come over to Babylon about the same time as Ezekiel, but they're younger and they end up in a different place. They end up in Babylon rather than out in the kind of wilderness area where the rest of the Jews are settled.
Right. Yeah. So yeah, you get a good allegiance that way, and you also get a good mix of, intel, right? So you get some intel,
Yep.
and then you get some allegiance there. So it's a pretty smart strategy. It works pretty well.
Yeah, and then of course the Persians will end up doing the same thing. When the Persians said the Babylonians, when they overthrew Assyria, part of the way they did it is they got the Medes and the Persians, who were all these kind of some semi-nomadic tribes that hadn't that were fighting with each other as much as anything else, and he got them to unite and help him overthrow Assyria. But the problem was he awakened a sleeping giant, because they realized that when they united, they were pretty powerful. So it wasn't very long before they came and bit the hand that fed them right, and they overthrew the Babylonian Empire, and that's the Persians. So the Medes were kind of the lead group when the Babylon first got these things going over in what's today Iran. And the Medes were, but the Persians took over the Medes and then took over everybody, and created the largest empire that existed for a very, very, very long time. One that even the Romans weren't able to fully take over.
You see the beginnings of that in, I think in Daniel chapters 8, 7, 8, 9, somewhere there. You see the beginnings of that, where some of those vassal lords are thrown over.
Yeah.
And so there's a lot of history, and of course, if you're following along, the Book of Mormon is about the same time, right? 600 BC is roughly when. In fact, you pointed it out in one of your earlier episodes with Brother Shannon. I think it's where it was. Anyway, you talked about that Jeremiah and Lehi are contemporaries, and they're probably in Jerusalem and probably are aware of each other, right?
Yeah, I would guess so. And I would guess that Lehi is aware of Ezekiel. Ezekiel may or may not be aware of Lehi, because I don't have the impression that Lehi's ministry in Jerusalem was that long. That the time between when he's called to start to preach repentance and when he's told to leave doesn't seem like it's a long period of time. So I don't know how much word traveled back to Ezekiel, but I'm sure that Lehi knew about Ezekiel. So the interesting thing is, it's a little bit hard to pinpoint whether Lehi is leaving before this first Babylonian conquest of Jerusalem and the taking away of elites into Babylon. And if he leaves before, then he's probably, Ezekiel hasn't started his ministry yet, so he wouldn't be aware of Ezekiel.
Right.
Or it may be that it's like 5 years after. So some people would suggest that Daniel goes into, we have a hard time establishing really good dates for some of these things. So some people would say he goes into Babylon around 600 BC. Some people would say around 605 BC. And that's actually kind of crucial for this question, because that means that it may be before or after Lehi leaves,
right.
and so on. And it's hard for us to know exactly what all Lehi experienced in terms of what was happening in Jerusalem and the Babylonians, to know exactly, was he there for one of the conquests? Did he leave before any of those things? And we can't tell exactly.
Right. There's several different battles that are happening, so we don't know if like you said, he could have been taken before or after, but I don't even know. Do you even know how many battles happened before Jerusalem is actually sacked and the temple destroyed? And is there any way to tell that?
Well, there are a few, but there are two key ones. That the first conquest and the second one. So the first one is around 600 or 605. Again, you get different dates, and then the destruction's about 586 So a number of years later, where you've got these years where Jehoiakim and then Zedekiah are subservient to Babylon. And Lehi leaves somewhere right in there. I mean, we have this date like 600 years before the time of Christ. Does that mean exactly 600 or about
Yeah, it
600?
says approximately, right?
And when he gets that, I mean, he's in the wilderness for 8 years. Does he get that like 2 years in, 3 years in, right? And honestly, those years are that uncertainty of those just 2 or 3 years means he was or wasn't in Jerusalem when
Right.
it was conquered, right? So we just can't tell.
We're pretty sure he left before the temple was destroyed because it wasn't destroyed when he left.
Yeah, no, he's definitely gone before the 586 one, which
Right.
is the big one with the destruction and taking away everyone else. And you remember Jacob says that he's had a revelation that happened.
Mm-hmm.
So they're definitely not there for that one. But the first one, the one where Daniel would have been taken away, I don't know.
Okay, well, that's a good setup for where we find Daniel. So Babylon has come in and taken, like you said, he's taken into the king's court, and he and his companions are representative of the Judah. So Judah and the Israelites, or what's left of the Israelites, is represented in the king's court. Now, this is funny. Most people will know Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, but how come they don't know we don't emphasize their Hebrew names?
Yeah, it's interesting. Well, I think, I mean, the practical answer is because in the story they're famous for their Babylonian names are what are used, but right. So they're treated a little bit differently textually than Daniel is, because with Daniel, they're all given Babylonian names. And they have these great names, but that are Hebrew names, but they're given Babylonian names. And with Daniel, the text almost always refers to him as Daniel rather than Belteshazzar, his Babylonian name. But after the first couple times of using the Hebrew names of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, after that it uses the Babylonian name. So we just kind of follow the text, but I don't know why the text did that. So anyway, but they have pretty cool names.
Yeah. So here, real quick, we'll go through this. I just like the names because I think we should know them as their Hebrew names, because all their names are based on the name of God. So Daniel is something like God is judge.
Yeah.
Belteshazzar is
my judge is God, I would say. Yeah.
My judge is God. Okay, that's a better translation.
Yeah. So Don or Dan is judge, E is my, and L is God. So yeah.
Oh, that's perfect. Well, I took it out of the Bible dictionary, but the Bible dictionary is not even as clear. That is so good. So we need to revise that. All right, good. And then Belteshazzar is I don't even know what the name is. The closest one I could find is protect his life or protect the king is the closest translation I could find.
Yeah, but it's based on the Babylonian god Bel. So you've got, I mean, literally their names end up with instead of Jehovah as part of their name, they end up with idolatrous gods as part of their name. So they probably weren't huge fans of it, but
well, yeah. And Hananiah. So the three companions to Daniel are Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, which Hananiah is God has favored. Mishael is something like who is God, or God is. It's kind of like a God is great, but I'm not sure exactly how to say that. It's who is God. It's kind of basically saying, this is my God. You have a better translation for that?
No, I mean, you've got the me, like who and the sha in there, which is like a relative. So yeah, I think that's a good translation of it. So L is God.
And then Azariah, which is Jehovah has helped. So all those ones are named. So I just think it's funny that we know their idolatrous sort of names, but we don't focus on their Hebrew names. We should focus on the Hebrew names: Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, and that's the three companions. Well, so
that brings up maybe another point that's worth pointing out with Daniel, if that's all right. That Daniel is the book is an interesting book in a number of ways, including this book is written in Aramaic. It's one of the few books that's written in Aramaic rather than Hebrew. It has some Hebrew in it, and that's interesting. I think it represents exactly what's going on, because the Babylonian Empire, they've started Aramaic has become their language, and it becomes like the lingua franca because Babylon conquers all this area. It becomes the language that everyone speaks. So actually, after the Babylonian captivity, the Jews will speak Aramaic. They'll maintain Hebrew as the literary or the liturgical language, right? That's what the Bible's in is Hebrew, but they will speak Aramaic. They actually changed the alphabet. So when you learn Hebrew today, you learn the Aramaic alphabet. So in Aramaic and Hebrew are very, very similar. They're very close. It's, I would say, even closer than, say, Spanish and Portuguese. They're very close. And they have the same alphabet, but different characters in the alphabet. So it would be a little bit like using the Greek alphabet to write English is what they start doing. They start using the Aramaic alphabet to write Hebrew, and that's lasted so long that all the Hebrew text you would read today, and the way it's written in Israel today, or throughout the Middle Ages or anything, it's actually Aramaic script, we should say, Aramaic script. So what they wrote before that is an older script that most people who learn Hebrew never even see or never even know. It's changed. Everything changed so fundamentally at this time. So, but they start to speak Aramaic, and Daniel is written in Aramaic. And Daniel is, it's confusing in some ways. So like the first half, or the first half of the book is written in third person. It's stories about Daniel. Except for chapter 4, which seems to be written by the king of Babylon. At least that's how it's portrayed to us. And then when you get chapter 7, verse 2, which we don't do for Come Follow Me, but in the book, once you get there, it's written first person as if Daniel himself is writing it.
Right.
So it's this hodgepodge of stuff. We don't know when it's compiled. We don't know who's doing it, what kind of sources they're drawing on. Just a lot of interesting and somewhat confusing stuff going on in there, but pretty fun.
Yeah, there are a few dates that don't match exactly with antiquity, but we don't know exactly what they could be referring to something different, or they could have combined the dates incorrectly. So we don't want to get too sidetracked on the mistakes there, but this is what happens when you're compiling records. Even Mormon says, if I've made some mistakes, it's the mistakes of men. So it doesn't take away from the spirit of the scriptures, but
and it is worth noting, it is hard to reconcile a couple of dates, and also the order of some of the Persian kings that they speak about, and who they, some of it just doesn't, it's hard to make it match up with what we know from other sources. I don't know the other sources maybe we don't know as well as we like. I think the most likely explanation is exactly what you're saying, that probably whoever is compiling this, and it may be a group of people, that they're not super familiar with Persian history. All right, they've got Daniel's letters, they've got some other things written, and they're putting it together. But as they provide the kind of commentary that ties it all together, they're a little weak on their history also when they make some mistakes or something like that.
I found some interesting things on that. And we're talking about again, we're going to be outside the scope of where Come Follow Me is, but in chapters, I think it's 8 or so, when they talk about the king then that's not exactly the king, but he might have been the second in charge. I found some neat stuff in that. Maybe we'll talk about that in another episode. But great. Well, so there are some things that are goofy, but 1 through 6 is usually, Daniel's 1 through 6 are usually understood as the first the life of Daniel and his 3 companions there. And that's the historical part. In fact, there's a big jump. I think by the time you get to chapter 7, Daniel would have been in his 70s. Something like that.
He's probably pretty old. He's in the Persian Empire, and hard to know exactly which king.
But there's a big jump. So that's why they usually put 1 through 6 together, because those are all should roughly be in about the same couple of years ish. Then there's a great big jump between chapters 6 and 7.
Yeah, well, and in some ways, maybe even there's a jump before chapter 6 as well. So chapters 1 through 5 are Daniel in Babylon.
Mm-hmm.
And then chapter 6 is Darius, who's probably the second king of the Persian Empire, although it could be a different Darius or something like that. So we've jumped a number of years to the Persian Empire in chapter 6, and then we get chapter 7, and later we've got other kings that are quite a bit later in the Persian
Right.
Empire, and sometimes hard to know unless we said exactly who in the world they are. And it's a very different focus. It's what we'd call apocalyptic literature. So we're not reading and they are I mean, I actually really enjoy them, but they're kind of crazy visions and dreams that in many ways mirror what we read in the book of Revelation. And but they're apocalyptic. They're these like highly symbolic visionary dreams about the end of the world and wars and battles. Well, actually, in some ways, they're about things from his period to the end of the world. But yeah, so there's one jump to chapter 6, and then another big jump to chapter 7. And 1 through 5 is we include chapter 6 because everybody loves the story of Daniel and the lion's den. So that's why it gets thrown in.
Yeah, that's
but
right.
the first 5 are in Babylon, and that's when he's young.
But yeah, right. And I forgot that 6 is already in the Persian Empire.
Yeah,
But that's a great one. Because he's quite a bit older, and if they threw him down the lion's den, I mean, he's old. He's an old guy, you
yeah,
know. But before we skip too far ahead, let's talk about a couple things that Hananiah, Azariah, and Mishael get up to. And
okay,
I like this is a great one. This is sort of if you're learning these stories, this is sort of a word of wisdom kind of thing when they first talk about this, where um, let's see, this is in chapter 1, and they're not allowed, or they want to abstain from eating the king's meat or the king's food. Now
yeah,
this is interesting. It really has, in my mind, less to do with actually what the food is. I mean, it might be different, it might be grains or wheats or whatever, but it has more to do, I think, that with the fact that the food that they're eating, or that the rest of the court is eating, would be have already been sacrificed to other gods, or and that kind of thing. It would have been blessed by other gods, um, and making it defiled in the Hebrew,
yeah.
in the Hebrew tradition, right?
So I think there are two issues going on. One is that they can't guarantee it's the word that is used today, and I don't know if they were using this word then or not, but it's kosher, right? And I mean they were
Right.
using the word, but maybe not in that same way. Kosher, that it's they can't guarantee that it's not pork, or that I mean even the way the animal is killed, you can't kill the animal in a way that the blood is going to be in the meat and all these kinds of things, and so they and you can't cook. At least this is the way it's interpreted later. I don't know if they're interpreting it this way in this time period, but you can't cook, say, meat products and milk products in the same area and the same things, or you couldn't cook meat and milk because it says you can't cook the meat in its mother's milk in the law of
Right.
Moses. So they can't guarantee that any food they're going to be given by these guys is actually kosher. And so they'll basically become vegetarian, so they don't have to worry about all of those different laws about what kinds of meat. There aren't any laws that say, well, you can eat rye, but you can't eat barley, right? So if they're getting the vegetarian stuff, they're going to be okay. So that's part of it. But
So I hear all the vegetarians out there. See, it's in the Bible. You can't eat meat. You're not supposed
yeah,
to. And that's what I'm saying. I think definitely eating a good diet is right. You want to eat things that are good for you, and avoid some
yeah,
of the rich foods. But it has more to do, I think, with the obedience to the law, that they're under the law of Moses,
right.
than exactly what they're eating. I mean, it's a combination of both, I'm sure. But I'm not sure that we are vindicating all vegetarians and vegans. And
No,
no offense to anybody
it,
who's
it has
vegetarian or vegan
nothing
out
to do
there.
with that,
Yeah,
honestly. It's just that there's one kind of food they can know was prepared in a way that wasn't against the law of Moses, and another kind of food that they can't know. That's all that is. Nothing to do with whether, I mean, when they were in Jerusalem, I'm sure they ate plenty of meat.
right.
So it's
So
not the meat or not, it's the knowledge of how it's prepared. Um,
so yeah, that's a great information, because like I said, no offense to anybody who has a particular dietary style. That's great, and what you
right.
should do. But some of the criticisms that people would say against our word of wisdom is, well, how come it has no prohibition against sugar and hot drinks? Is that hot chocolate or is it
Yeah.
pear? All those kind of things. And I'm like, the point of it is to do things that are good, and we get the blessings from the obedience to it. And if there's some things where you need to interpret between hot chocolate and coffee, if that's what you need to do, well, okay, you figure that out. Then you can figure that out on your own. um, it doesn't need to be prescribed in all these things, but we get the blessings by the obedience to the law, or to the spirit of that law, right? And I
Yeah.
think that's what they're getting the blessings from that. It's not that what they're eating is particularly um, better on its own. And it might be that they're eating better grains or whatever. But the main thrust of this is that this is approved by the law of Moses. It's in obedience to their word of wisdom, basically,
Right.
and not just because they're eating a particular diet that can be figured out by us, and then we can figure out this magical diet and it'll cure all your ills.
Yeah. No, and I think that they're blessed um, as they eat what they end up eating because they are doing it in order to follow
Right.
to the best of their ability what God has asked them to do. And as you said, that changes over time. I always talk about, under the law of Moses, they could drink wine, but they couldn't eat lobster, and we can eat lobster, but we can't drink wine. And I honestly don't know who's getting the better deal because I haven't had wine, but I quite like lobster, so I'm happy with the way it's worked out. But I don't know, right?
Right.
So,
Exactly. But
and you mentioned
the,
a
the
second
obedience
point.
comes by
So,
the
oh,
yeah, yeah.
sorry, go ahead.
No. I was just saying you already covered the obedience is to the law at the time they understand it. Things can change from time to time. We follow what the prophets say, and we get blessings from that. So anyway, go ahead.
That's right. So the interesting thing is, even with what I just said about why they're doing it, the text doesn't say what they're worried about with the king's meat. It just says, so if we look in chapter 1, verse 8, it says, Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with the portion of the king's meat. And by meat, it means food, all right, nor
Mm-hmm.
with the wine which he drank. Therefore, he requested of the prince of the eunuchs that he might not defile himself. And and as a result, they're given this chance. Well, let's see how you do when you're eating this thing you'd like to eat, and they do fine. Um, so he doesn't tell us exactly why. So it's us reading into the text this whole business about kosher laws. Although I'm fairly convinced that has to be part of it because that's got to be, and that's why meat instead of vegetables, and right, because that's where the difficult things get. So I'm sure that has to be part of it. But I think you're right, and this is another thing we can read into the text is this possibility. We don't know. We're reading both into the text, but the um, even in Jerusalem, uh, priestly families and so on, and other families, you bring your sacrifice to the temple, and you make the sacrifice, and some of it is going to be, if you're doing a burnt offering, is going to be burnt up to the Lord.
Mm-hmm.
But most of it, the priests get a portion, and this is how they eat, and then the family eats the rest, right? You eat
Right.
sacrifice. Now, it was killed the right way. You didn't bring a non-kosher animal, so it's great. It's all kosher. It's all good to eat that sacrifice. And it's a sacrifice to Jehovah. The king is going to be someone who is able to eat of the sacrifices in Babylon, right? So some of the meals that are available in the king's house were surely from animals that were sacrificed to Marduk or whoever else, and Nebu and so on. So the question is, first of all, you don't know that they were killed in a kosher way, and second, if this was a sacrifice to an idolatrous god, you don't want any part of it.
Right.
This will end up being an issue even in New Testament times, where they're trying to figure out, do Gentiles who have joined the church have to keep kosher laws? And they say no, they don't, but they shouldn't eat from meals that were for sacrifice to an idolatrous god.
Right.
That's the way how they come down on this in the New Testament, and I would guess they felt the same way in the Old Testament. So they it doesn't say it for sure in there, but I would guess that that's another concern that Daniel and his friends have.
I agree. I think they're getting blessed by the obedience portion, and keeping themselves separate from, let's call it the world, Babylon.
Yeah,
I mean, it's separate from Babylon. So
that's exactly right.
yeah, so keep yourself separate from Babylon, and you'll do better off. And they are. They after it's a short period of time, and they feel, was it 2 weeks? Is that right?
10 days, I think.
10 days. 10 days. Okay. So, and they are better. They look better.
Yeah.
And they're like, hey, these guys got it going on. They've got to figure it out. So
Yeah.
they are elevated. So that's the first time when we start seeing the Hebrews getting a little bit of an edge in the court because they are following the we call it the gospel, but they would call it following the prophets or following the law of Moses.
Yeah, and keeping covenant. So we could both agree in both uh, both eras on that phrase that they're keeping covenant.
Excellent. And that's what the theme of this whole podcast is about keeping the covenant and keeping on the covenant path. And that's what all the scriptures are about, really, is this is the covenant and keep on the covenant path. Okay, so to move on here,
maybe we can just highlight verse 17 as I'm thinking about it.
Yeah.
Because what you get is it says these 4 children, and this is after the whole story with that they're going to just be able to continue to eat according to the way they want to eat. And these 4 children, God gave them knowledge and skill in all learning and wisdom. So they're basically in school at the court, supposed to be able to learn so that they can function as useful court figures for the king of Babylon, and they're excelling. But then you get the second part there. And Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams. So they're all being blessed by God to excel in what they're doing and to learn all sorts of things. But Daniel's got this additional gift that he has visions and dreams, that God teaches him things and he understands them. And that, of course, sets the stage for really the rest of the book of Daniel, because we've got, from chapter 7 on, it's like all visions and dreams. But even before that, you get all sorts of visions and dreams going on. And so that's a key transition and distinction between Daniel and even his amazing and worthy friends. It's not that they're more worthy than or that Daniel's more worthy than they are. I don't think so. I think he's just got a different role, and so he's given a different gift to fulfill his role. Not that they're one whit behind him in terms of righteousness, to kind of paraphrase a Book of Mormon phrase, right?
Right. Yeah, right. I think that's right. And, in a smaller way, it says the knowledge, skill, learning, and wisdom. And in a smaller way, what's the end of the Doctrine and Covenants, section 89, which is the word of wisdom say? And they shall find wisdom and great treasures of knowledge, even hidden treasures.
Yeah.
So there we go. So we're given the same type of promise in our day. Like, we may not be a prophet or interpret dreams or see writing on the wall, but we shall find hidden treasures by following the word of wisdom and by keeping ourselves, again, out of Babylon, by keeping ourselves with the covenant. We are promised learning ourselves and understanding in things, even hidden treasures. So I think that's also a neat parallel there.
And maybe this is it is a tangent. It's not a maybe, but a little tangent. But I find it interesting. This is part of how this becomes real to me, right? That we are learning today in a day where we're seeing really almost plague-sized epidemic or pandemic of mental health difficulties, right? That we're learning that there is a real connection between what they call the gut-brain axis and so on, that there's a real connection between what's going on in terms of nutrition and gut health, biodomes and phages and all sorts of things like that, and your brain's ability to produce what the chemicals it needs to function properly in terms of thinking, in terms of understanding, and how you feel, right? And most parents these days know someone either in their family or closer family who's struggling with these issues, and we're finding, wow, if we can find good nutrition and good products, things like that can help with that it affects your brain. But I find it interesting that science is finally catching up to this notion that there's a connection between wisdom and knowledge and what you're eating, right there, and your nutritional state. We're finally catching up to that and saying, what both Joseph Smith and Daniel told us a couple hundred years ago, a couple thousand years ago, that's good stuff. Right?
Seems like maybe someone was listening to the Lord.
Yeah.
I used to say this to my seminary students all the time. I would say, look, I know that we don't drink alcohol, and it looks really fun to go to these parties, and I know it's great. But I'm telling you, I know I'm only a 40-something-year-old at the time I was old guy, and you don't care what I say, but I've been where you are. I've seen this whole thing, and I'm telling you, the end of that road is zero. There's zero
Yeah.
at the end of that road.
Yeah.
With the parties and the whatever. And we see that you talk about the epidemic. I mean, the drugs have gotten stronger, and the addictions and all the things that are happening is worse and worse all the time. And there's just no good end of that road. There's no good
Yeah.
end of that road. And you think you might, it's just a little bit, and I'll just do it now, and I won't do this forever. Yeah, that's what every alcoholic and every drug addict started off with. I don't know if they all started. I mean,
Yeah.
I don't know very many of them that said, I'm going to go straight into this and try to get addicted and just ruin my life. That's what I'm going to go for.
Yeah.
All started with the beginning of that road. And I'm telling you, if there's any young people listening, it's not worth it. I know I'm just an old guy. What do I know? But I've seen the beginning and end of many stories that started that way. It's just, stick with Daniel and Azariah and Michelle. They know what they're talking about.
Yep.
And
I don't think you'll meet anyone even that has recovered from that. So that's a recovering alcoholic or recovering drug addict or something. So they've gotten themselves eventually to a good place, and a lot of them don't. But even those who do would say, "Oh, I wish I had not gone to that place.
Oh yeah,
that was not a good place to go. If I could do it over again, I would not go to that place."
That's right. Me being a comedian, I've played in a lot of places that serve alcohol. Right, I'm around it all the time, and I had a joke. I didn't really do it very much, but I had a joke that was kind of like, I don't drink at all, and everybody's like, "Oh, you're a pansy," or "You're what." But then if I just started saying, "No, I'm a recovering alcoholic," suddenly I was a hero. Hey, everybody, don't mess with this guy. All right,
Yeah.
all the sodas are on me.
Yeah.
Suddenly I was a hero for overcoming it, but I was a pansy for not doing it. I don't know. I
Yeah.
don't know if it was the funniest joke ever that I ever did, but it was just kind of a funny way that people do it. People think that you're dumb if you haven't tried it, but then if you're overcoming it, everybody recognizes how hard it is to overcome it later, and suddenly you're a good guy. So again, be a pansy. Just don't go there. It's just not worth it. It's not worth the time, the effort, the money, all that stuff that's involved. It's just not something you should do. Anyway, all right, so that's good. Anything else in chapter 1 that you want to run over?
Oh, we could spend all day in all of these chapters, but if we did, we wouldn't get to any of the others, so we better not.
Okay, so let's jump up to the next one, because I want to get to at least Daniel 3. I mean, we talked a little bit about the whole scope of Daniel 1 through 6, but I do want to get to Daniel 2, and then I want to talk specifically in Daniel 3 before we end our session today. In Daniel 2, Nebuchadnezzar's dream. We talk about this all the time, and I want to go over this again, because we talked about it back when we were talking about the marvelous work and the wonder in Isaiah. And this is Daniel's dream. So if you haven't looked at Daniel 2 yet, this is the dream where he sees the image of it's a statue, basically.
And it's the king that sees it, and then Daniel has to have his own vision to see it himself, right?
Exactly. So Nebuchadnezzar, that, by the way, I don't even know if that's pronounced right. How would you actually say it?
I think that's as good as any. I mean, we're anglicizing it, right? So that's as good as any way.
I've heard of different pronunciations, but Nebuchadnezzar is what we'll go with for now. He sees this thing and this big image. It's a big, tall image, and it's made of different materials. There's gold and brass and iron, and then mixed materials. There's clay and iron together. And he sees this, and no one can interpret it for him. And finally, someone says, Daniel can interpret it for you. He can tell you what it means. And we get this. So, Kerry, take us through. What do you find in that? What do we need to know about this? I mean, we know a little bit about represents the different kingdoms, but oftentimes we talk about this and we apply it to our own day, which again, like we've said many times, these things will apply to your day, but they have application in the time that they are written primarily, right?
Yeah. So Daniel at least gives him the interpretation that that some of this represents him and what's going on with him. So
Nebuchadnezzar, you mean?
Yeah, with Nebuchadnezzar. Thank you. Yeah, to be more clear. So if we're looking at chapter 2, say verse 39, so Well, verse 38, he says, "Thou art this head of gold." So we've got pretty solid interpretation on that one, that the head represents the Babylonian Empire. And then after thee shall arise another kingdom inferior to thee, and another third kingdom of brass, which shall bear rule over all the earth, and a fourth kingdom shall be strong as iron. So it's clear that these represent kingdoms, right? I mean, there's no doubt about that, and kingdoms that come one after the other. I find it interesting, and this may just be what he has to say to make the king happy, that he'll say that the next empire is inferior to his, because in most ways you could measure an empire. It's the Persian Empire is not inferior to the Babylonian Empire, but anyway, I don't know how exactly what value we're measuring to see whether it's superior or inferior. But anyway,
exactly. So, and maybe Daniel's being nice, like, it's gonna be less than yours. Don't worry about it. You're the gold.
Yeah, I mean, I think you probably do have to tell the king that. Don't worry, you're the very best. You're the top of everything that
you're
ever
the gold
will
standard,
be.
And everybody else.
Yeah.
Okay.
You just say what you got to say. So, but typically the way we would interpret this, the way that most people interpret this, and President Kimball once mentioned some of this in a talk. I don't know that he was saying prophetically this is how it is, but he at least didn't disagree with it. That you'd have the gold head as the Babylonian Empire, and then that silver like torso as the Persian Empire, and then you get the brass part, and that's probably the Hellenistic era, right? Starting with Alexander the Great, and you get this Hellenistic or Greek empires, the Ptolemies and the Seleucids, and so on. And then you get the Roman Empire, which is probably the iron, and then you get the iron and clay, and that may be, the Roman Empire actually divides into two, and you get the Eastern and the Western. And we always talk about Western Rome because that's kind of cultural descendant. Europe and America are cultural descendants of that, but actually the Eastern Roman Empire in Constantinople, which becomes Byzantium, which becomes Istanbul. Anyway, the same place, just different names. Well, actually, Byzantium was Byzantine as its original name. Anyway, it's probably the stronger of the two for a very, very, very long time. Really, the Crusades might be where that changes. But in any case, you've got this divided part, and a lot of people think of that as the legs are two different parts, right? And then you get the iron and clay, which are all sorts of little kingdoms that flow out of that. And a lot of people think of that as Europe and all the things that come as those two parts of the Roman Empire fall apart. So that's the way that at least the statue, I mean, we've got the next part that I know you want to talk about, and so I'll let you start out on that. But the statue, that's how we often interpret it, and it makes good sense. Does it mean there aren't other possible interpretations? No, but I think it makes a lot of sense. It's very Eurocentric way of interpreting this, but it works fairly well, because at least in terms of Babylon, that is the succession of empires that are controlling that area of the world. It says nothing about what's happening in Asia, right? But it talks about it in terms of the Babylonian king and his empire and what will happen to that. That's a good interpretation.
Yeah, excellent. And I had this, the reason why this made it, the scriptures are real. I had this discussion with someone of another faith, and they were talking about this, and I think he was kind of testing me. He's like, what this means? I was like, oh, sure. It means, the different kingdoms. And, oh, yeah. And then I said, well, what about the stone that's cut without hands? Stone that's cut from the mountain without hands. And he's just sort of like, didn't really know much about that. Or if he didn't, I don't know if he didn't know about it, but he just didn't focus on that. I'm like, that's the important part. The important part is the stone that is cut forth that comes and smashes the statue and takes over everything. What's the stone? Now, in our church, obviously, we talk about this as the restoration, but it's really more to do with Christ than just the. Now, it has to do with the church as far as the church is based on Christ, but this is Christ that comes through, who is the rock, who's the foundation of everything. It is Christ that comes forward and smashes all these things and sets up an everlasting kingdom. Now, we oftentimes refer to this, well, this is the church that comes and fills the whole earth. Well, yes, in so much that it is based on Christ's church, and it is Christ's church that covers the whole earth. But it has to do specifically with Christ. It's not just the restoration of the church in our day. This is Jesus. This is the rock. And then we're founded on the rock, and then the rock takes over the world. But we kind of skip over that. We're like, oh yeah, we got the Babylonian, the Persian, and the Roman Empire, and then there's all the European ones, and then America comes, and okay, that does have application, yes, but the primary application is this is Jesus that comes and establishes his church first, and that is the rock that is cut forth without hands, and then of course,
and eventually the kingdom of God triumphs over everything else.
Oh yeah, exactly. So by the time we get to the feet of clay, that feet of clay can stretch all the way from the Western and Eastern, Europe, like you're talking about, the Eastern Orthodox and the West. It can go all the way to the feet cover a lot more time than the other pieces covers. What I'm saying.
Yeah.
And but we have a interesting thing there. So we just need to make sure that we're focusing on Christ. This is, of course, Christ's church that comes in and takes over everything and is established, and all the rest of the kingdoms are like nothing, because it's nothing compared to the kingdom that Christ establishes. So anyway, that's an interesting thing, and I think that we gloss over that right away. Again, you mentioned it in many of your other ones where yes, we should apply these things to ourselves and to our day. That's great, but they have a primary interpretation in the time that they're done. And this is looking forward to the Savior first and foremost, and then his kingdom later that comes in our day. Yes, it does come and will be establishing all the way through the millennium. So we have a very long time horizon from here on out, but it's Christ that we focus on first.
That's very good. That's excellent. Very good. And I would say in some ways, I find it interesting that you see the stone that's cut out of the mountains without hands, and that it starts to roll and it takes a while, right? So in some ways, you could make an argument that in some ways that's Christ and what he does with the apostles, because that starts something that will be restored in our day.
Mm-hmm.
But in some ways, you can argue that it's that restoration is maybe that's one that's cut out. I don't know, but the point is, it takes a while before this big rolling stone comes and fills everything, and we're in the middle of that process still.
Excellent. Yes, it does take a little while. The events have to unfold, and I guess we here on Earth need to learn a few things over a few thousand years, get ourselves situated. Okay, let's move on to chapter 3, and this is I think we've already gone a good long time now, so maybe we'll end on this part for today. Like I said, we've already kind of covered the stories of Daniel, and of course there's other good stories. The Lion's Den is great, but this one has a particular application to me, I think, in Daniel 13. And in Daniel 13
or 3,
I'm sorry, Daniel 13, Daniel 3, and I'm going to start in verse. Let's see. So in verse 13 is where I was getting at. It's 3:13. This is Nebuchadnezzar is angry because they have set up. The king has put out a decree that they have to worship. Whenever you hear the harp or the psaltery or these different instruments, you have to basically when their national anthem is played, everybody has to bow down to this particular image that the king has set up. And
we don't know if it's the national anthem. They just say
no, that's me just saying
when they hear the sound of the cornet, the flute, the harp, the sackbut, psaltery, and we don't even know what in the world all those are. A bunch of musical instruments, right? Anyway, so it might be.
It doesn't say the national anthem. I'm just saying that's kind of like how I see it in my head.
Oh,
right. That's how, whenever you hear these things, everybody has to immediately recognize the greatness of this God and represented by this particular image. And it seems like the other people in the court are trying to set up Daniel and particularly Azariah, Hananiah, and Mishael, and they're like, "Hey, did you see these guys? They're not worshiping your statue. They're not doing it. I'm telling on them."
Yeah.
And so the king Nebuchadnezzar is kind of stuck. He's already decreed this, and he can't go back on his own decree. He's got to do it. So he calls these guys in and is like, "How come you're not doing this? And you got to do this." And they say, "We're not going to do that. We're not going to follow along. Our God demands this of us, and we will not turn from that." So in verse 17, verse 16, I'm going to go here, and this is their Babylonians. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said, O King Nebuchadnezzar, we are not careful to answer in this matter. So they're saying, we're going to tell you straight out. This is what we think. If it so be our God who we serve will be able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace. Because I should say that if you haven't read this, they're going to get thrown into a furnace. If you don't turn to my God and do what I'm telling you, throwing you in this furnace. And they said, well, I'm going to tell you straight. I'm sorry, we're not going to do that. Our God is going to be able to deliver us from the fiery furnace and bring us out of the can. But here's the key, verse 18. But if not, be it known to thee, O king, we will not serve thy gods nor worship the golden image which thou hast set up. This is an interesting, but if not. This is one of the few times in Scripture where you see two different ways. A lot of times you see people say, my king will protect me, and he does, or he doesn't, whatever. But he says, our king will protect, our God will protect us. But if not, it's not because he can't. It's because we're not going to do it anyway. We're going to do it, and if he has other plans for us, that's so be it. And this is an interesting thing. This is I've heard several different talks about this before. I know Elder Maxwell gave a talk in 1985. I have a little note in my scriptures here with the different talks that have been given on this exact subject. Elder Lance Wickham of the 70, October 2012, 2002, and then Dennis Simmons, April 2004, also talks about this. And it seems to me, and maybe someone can find this in the comments below and put it down there. It seems to me I've heard this even in recent general conferences. Someone has said this. And so please help us out and find that reference for us. But someone else has referred to this, but if not. And I think this is key. This is key to us in our life. I think that we think that things should turn out a certain way. We think that we're living the scriptures or we're living the gospel a certain way, and that we are owed a particular amount of protection or blessings or whatever. And that may be. We may get that blessing. We may be preserved miraculously, or we may have whatever. Sometimes it doesn't work out that way. But it doesn't mean that God can't do these things. It means that there's a different way. I think of a couple of references from scriptures. Maybe you have your own. But I think about the anti-Nephi Lehis. There's many of them that are slaughtered. They're like, we're not going to fight. We've made a covenant. We're not going to do this. And they get whacked. And that's terrible. And Abinadi, later on, gives a great thing, and they throw him into the fire anyway. And there's lots of people that get thrown in. Even in more modern times, we have some massacres that happen to the saints that we don't think deserve it. And like, why do they deserve? They didn't deserve that. They should have been miraculously preserved. And I think that this is a key thing. Sometimes it's a but if not. And I would recommend that you read those talks from, or you can watch them if you go to the video parts on the church website. Look at Elder Maxwell's talk and those other talks about but if not. They can say it far better than I can. And I think that's a great lesson for us, that sometimes things don't work out, but it doesn't mean that we should diminish our faith because of
it. I can't agree more. Maybe it's worth just reading maybe 2 paragraphs from Elder Maxwell's talk, which is called "Willing to Submit," and that's really his point he makes here. So 1 paragraph: we have been given 3 special words, but if not, by 3 submissive young men who entered their fiery furnace, knowing our God is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace. But if not, be it known unto thee, O king, that we will not serve thy gods. So we'll skip a paragraph and go down and read. It is only by yielding to God that we can begin to realize his will for us. And if we truly trust God, why not yield to his loving omniscience? After all, he knows us and our possibilities much better than do we. And Elder Maxwell had such a great way of saying things, but I think that's just so profound that's, and I agree 100% with what you're saying. What a lesson to learn from them. They knew he could. They didn't know if he would, and it didn't matter to them. They were going to do it the right way, whether God protected them in this life or that protection came in the next. They were following God's will.
I think that is one of the best examples of scripture or demonstrations of faith in scriptures, because it's great to be rescued, but it's also great to know that even if you're not, it doesn't affect you. We
Yeah.
all want to have a miraculous rescue. We want the blessings from God, and we should. Elder or President Nelson has told us we should expect miracles if we do certain things. Okay, that's great. But just don't be so caught up that you know the right way about things. Sometimes
Yeah.
you don't know what the end of that road is or what the Lord has in store. And the anti-Nephi, there was many of them that were killed, but the testimony converted more than were killed. So, maybe that's a miracle in itself. So anyway, I just think this is a great thing. We skip over these three little words. I don't know if we skip over them, but I don't know if people give them the due that I think they deserve. That of all the sections of Scripture, I like just the way these three young men. The Lord will preserve us. They're facing a king who's all powerful in their minds and in their world. He's all powerful. He's like, no, we're not going to do it, and our God's going to save us. But if He doesn't, we're going to do it anyway.
Yeah.
We're still going to follow Him. We're still going to follow our God, and we're not going to lose faith in that. I think that's fantastic. That's a great story. That's kind of where I wanted to end on today. What do you want to add to that?
I want to add amen and hallelujah.
All right. Well, that's great. Well, anyway, that's Daniel 1-6, and again, with Daniel and Lion's Den is in 6, and you can read that, and it's another great faith. It's very similar to this one. Oh, and by the way, the end of the story in this one is here, in case you haven't read it yet and don't know this. They stoked that furnace as hot as it can go. They say 7 times, and again, we know the term 7 may not actually mean 7. It may mean just the top, the tippity top, however high it can go. They've stoked it as hot as it can be, and even a couple of guys even die just trying to get them close to the furnace. So the story says, and they're thrown in there, and they don't die, and in fact, they see someone likened to the Son of God. It says here, or the Son of God's his head, they might have said. But anyway, do you think that was Jesus in there, or do you think it was a ministering angel, or do we know?
I don't know that we know. The way it's written suggests it's the Messiah, it's the Savior, but it's not conclusive. And in the end, I don't know how much of a difference. If it's not him, it's someone that represents him, so it's as if it was him, and
right.
He represents the Father, so it's as if it was the Father. So not a lot of. I'm curious too, but since I don't know, I'll just have to be satisfied with saying it doesn't matter.
But they do have a great. Their faith is rewarded. They are preserved, and heavenly messenger at the very minimum, and maybe even the Messiah himself comes and visits them, and they see them walking around in the fire, and even the king's like, oh well, all right, you guys got me. Your God is great. I'm gonna pay attention to you guys and come on out of that fire, and they're not touched at all. No sin. They don't even smell like fire.
Yeah.
I mean, I can't go to a scout camp out and not smell like fire. They don't even smell like fire.
Yep.
So
they could have roasted their marshmallows and not had campfire smell, but I can't.
That would have been a good story too. Well, anyway, it's a fantastic story, and but I really like that thought that the Lord may have other plans for us, but we'll just press forward, expecting the best, hoping for the best, and that's what that's the best our faith can demand of us.
Amen.
All right, great to see you again. I will see you again whenever else we connect. Great to be with you as always, Kerry, and thanks so much for joining us on The Scriptures Are Real. Hope you got something out of this, and I hope you can like and subscribe and whatever it is that this platform will allow you to do to share it with other people, that they also might be able to get something out of this. Thanks again for joining me.